What role should religion, Christianity in particular, play in public life? Now, that question is at the center of legislative and public debates in statehouses, on the streets across the country. It stems largely from the growing influence of Christian nationalism, an ideology based around the idea that the United States is fundamentally a Christian nation and that its government should follow conservative Christian religious principles. I put all of those terms, conservative Christian religious and principles, in quote marks. Texas has become one of, if not the epicenter of this movement. Here, proponents have advanced legislation that effectively blurs the line, the traditional line as it's understood in the United States, between church and state, largely in the realm, but not exclusively, of public education. One example, a bill introduced in 2023 that would have required the display of the Ten Commandments in all public school classrooms. That bill didn't pass, but proved to be a model for similar bills in a dozen other states, including Louisiana, which became the first state to sign such legislation into law. Now, with us today, to make sense of, to better understand what is meant by Christian nationalism, the Christian nationalist movement, and its implications for public life and public policy, is first Michael Emerson, the Baker Institute's Harry and Hazel Chavanne Fellow in Religion and Public Policy. He's the director of our Religion and Public Policy, really Religion and Public Life program. He's published widely on this topic, and he served as the principal investigator of the largest national study of religion and race ever conducted. Also with us, we're very happy to have him, is David Brockman, a non-resident fellow at the Institute and an adjunct professor at Texas Christian University and Southern Methodist University, where he teaches courses in religion and religious studies. His research on the Christian nationalist movement in Texas has been widely featured in the media, including most recently an article which received wide circulation by Alva Kaufman, co-published by ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine. You may have read it there. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This is Baker Briefing. Michael, David, thank you all for joining us today, and I will start off the discussion. Earlier this year, the New York Times opinion columnist David French wrote that to understand what Christian nationalism is, you have to understand what it's not. So, David, I'll start with you. What is it and what isn't it?
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ambassador Satterfield, for inviting us here to talk about this important subject. David French makes a very important point. It's necessary to distinguish what Christian nationalism isn't from what it is. First off, I agree with French that it's essential not to conflate Christian activism with Christian nationalism. He's absolutely right about that. It's Christian nationalism, at least as I understand it, and as I use the term in my own research, is not Christian participation in politics. It's not a Christian applying her religious perspective and values to political issues, such as, let's say, Martin Luther King Jr. applying his understanding of the Bible to the civil rights movement. So it's not Christian activism, but what it is, as David French mentions, is that Christian nationalism advocates Christian supremacy in the political realm. It's basically, as I define it, it's a religious and political ideology in its fullest form, as found in texts by, say, David Barton or Robert Jeffress. It makes a historical claim that the founders intended to create an explicitly Christian nation governed by Bible-based law and public policy, that the United States has departed from that initial vision, and that we should return to that vision, effectively that government today should prefer and promote Christianity and base laws on the Bible or Christian values. Usually what's included with that is the idea that church-state separation is a myth or various interpretations that would minimize church-state separation. And there's also an associated branch of Christian nationalism, or wing of it, I guess, which is basically the idea that to be a real American is to be a Christian, or at least a certain kind of Christian. So that would be my answer to that question.
David, a couple questions. This concept, the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. Certainly, there was a widely held deist perspective amongst the founding fathers, which is a bit different from what we now understand to be a classic Christian approach. But that issue, was there in fact an intent to found, I'll go beyond that, separation of church and state, the bedeviling question The Founding Fathers were determined that there would not be a state church, an establishment of church. They were disestablishmentarians with no establishment to oppose, except the Church of England. How did separation of church and state come to be understood as it has been traditionally in the U.S. from those various beginnings?
Yeah, very good question. I would say that there was a definite, and I'm following here some political scientists whose work I use in my own teaching, Kenneth Walden, Allison Calhoun Brown, argue that there was a strong Protestant Christian influence on the founders. That was one of several influences on the founders, including deism, including Enlightenment thought, including economic interests and motivations, and so on. And that there were some Protestant ideas, such as a strong belief in the inherent sinfulness of humans, that perhaps influenced parts of the Constitution, such as the principle of separation of powers, to keep any one segment of the government from gaining too much power. Also, the separation of church and state idea also seems to be related to that notion as well. Again, the idea of not granting too much power to any one particular segment of the population, and in this case being the church or a national church, which would have a kind of religious monopoly on the nation. Historically, I think that there isn't really a very good case for saying that the founders intended for the United States to be an explicitly Christian nation for some of the reasons that you mentioned earlier, Ambassador. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. No mention of God in the Constitution, let alone Jesus Christ. That was criticized by some conservative Christians at the time of the debate over the Constitution. No religious test for public office, the Establishment Clause, which you mentioned before. And also a lot of evidence from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in particular, who worried about the danger of religious tyranny, something that there has been a long record of in Europe and in Great Britain. And also Madison in particular raised the possibility that an established church, or attempting to regulate the religious beliefs and practices of Americans, would be unenforceable because at that time, as today, basically the United States was a nation of religious minorities. So even Christianity itself is a collection of religious minorities with no particular sect constituting a majority of Americans. And so I think Madison's worry was prophetic at that time, because we're in a much more diverse country today than in 1787.
And Michael, speaking of today, why is this phenomenon, this movement, gaining such ground now? We have been through religious revivals in the United States in cyclical fashion, and quite dramatically so, millennialist revivals. What's different about this phenomenon? Why now?
Yeah, well, politics, of course, is always in a contested field and in a context. And that context for Christian nationalists is they feel disempowered. Secularists are taking over the country. They took out the Bible and prayer from schools. Of course, that's a while ago, but those narratives have stayed. And then also the growing diversity. Like, there's a sense of we're losing a country we knew, and so we've got to do something about it. And that something about it is return to the perceived idea that we are a Christian nation. So, who are these people? It's amazing. 30% of the voting electorate would subscribe to Christian nationalism. Let me give you how they measure that, by the way, in case you're interested. It's usually 5 questions. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Pretty direct. So these are folks that, when they're Christian nationalists, they agree with these statements. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from Christian foundations, we'll lose our country. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And then the last question, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So about 30% of Americans are in agreement with that. In red states, 40%. No real difference by gender, but those with less than a college degree are more likely to support that than those with postgraduate degrees. 51% of all Republicans subscribe to Christian nationalism. The single most supportive group is white evangelical Christians. 66% subscribe to Christian nationalism. But interestingly, Hispanic Protestants, who just a couple of years ago only a minority would, this latest round of surveys, 55% of Hispanic Protestants said they support Christian nationalism.
African Americans, the black community?
Very little.
Even in the evangelical movements, within the church?
Yeah, so what they find in the research is even if they agree with these statements, they have very different implications for how that gets interacted into politics. And we can talk about that later, but yes.
Okay, this brings us to the policies themselves. And David, Texas is viewed, and I welcome your view if viewed correctly or not, as the epicenter of this nationalist, Christian nationalist movement, a laboratory, if you will, for religious legislation that could be replicated in other states. And you've written about all of this, including the legislation. What specific public policies are we talking about here?
Right. I think that it is a fair point to call Texas a kind of laboratory for Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism has been a force in particularly Texas GOP politics for several decades now, going back at least to the 1990s, probably earlier. And a number of the, as I mentioned in one of the reports that I've done for the Baker Institute, I try to show many of the top office holders and politicians in the state have expressed Christian nationalist sentiments or sing from the Christian nationalist hymn book. And there's a saying that what happens in Texas often happens around the rest of the country. It happens first here and then elsewhere. And I think that that's true. We've seen that in several cases. One is the Ten Commandments bill mentioned earlier. That was in 2023. Legislative session, passed in the Senate, failed in the House, didn't make it into law. There was another bill back in 2019 that was sponsored by Senator Brian Hughes that would have required Bible instruction in English classes. That also didn't pass at the time. These are explicitly Christian, or at least explicitly Bible kind of bills. But the other policies and legislation that I've looked at doesn't explicitly promote Christianity, but it does definitely weaken church-state separation, or arguably weaken church-state separation in ways that I think would be congenial to Christian nationalism. So those would include education policy. The very first report that I did for the Baker Institute back in 2016 was on the Christian nationalist influence on the Texas social studies curriculum, and actually that continues to this day. In the legislature, we've had the chaplains bill, which did become law, and that arguably undermines church-state separation by allowing schools to hire clergy, chaplains, religious chaplains, to serve as counselors with no criteria for credentialing and no prohibition on proselytizing. The voucher legislation, or ESA legislation, education savings accounts legislation that I'm sure you've all heard about, that weakens church-state separation insofar as taxpayers would be required to pay for religious instruction indirectly. So you've got that issue. And then there's the new proposed K through 5 reading and language arts curriculum, which we may talk about here as well, which has been called a Bible-infused curriculum, and I think that's a fair comment as well. So.
And David, on that subject, you have reviewed the curriculum proposed, and it used to be the case that if you were attempting to publish a textbook for national use, you had to be able to sell it in Texas. The Texas market and constraints of that market for decades shaped what you read in California or Maine or Florida or anywhere else. That's still the case?
It is. This new curriculum, or set of instructional materials, if you want to call it that, which has now been relabeled the Bluebonnet Learning Materials, I think it is. That's a new step in the curriculum development process. I'll talk about that in a moment. We still have in Texas the same procedures for textbook adoption and so forth that have been around for years now. So we still have the State Board of Education still develops and adopts curriculum standards, which then textbook publishers have to meet. They have to meet a certain percentage of the standards. The State Board of Education then adopts certain textbooks, and the ISDs then can choose from that list. This new curriculum is kind of groundbreaking in that the state of Texas has contracted with an outside developer to create an open source curriculum and instructional materials for grades kindergarten through 5. And then there's a financial incentive for ISDs to adopt that curriculum. So this is actually a curriculum developed especially for Texas. And that's the curriculum that I reviewed this past summer.
And you use strong language, verges on Christian proselytization.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. That's what I found. I was hoping that I wouldn't find something this inadequate, I guess, for Texas kids. I'll put it that way. For one thing, I found that there was far too much emphasis on Christianity and the Bible in this curriculum. Again, this is for public schools, and far too much emphasis on Christianity, There is very little coverage of Judaism and basically no coverage of rabbinic Judaism, that is, Judaism after the biblical period, in the Common Era. Only 3 brief references to Islam and no references to Hinduism or Buddhism, at least in the draft that I looked at over the summer. The curriculum developers worked in detailed lessons on biblical passages. So, for example, in kindergarten art appreciation unit, they work in a study of the biblical creation and flood stories at some length, and students are asked in one of the exercises after they've read through this material to respond with the order in which things were created. Okay, so this is an art appreciation lesson. In grade 5, there's a lesson about the Last Supper, about Leonardo's great fresco, The Last Supper, but it contains a lengthy quote from the Gospel of Matthew and much more than is warranted, in other words, for a grade 5 student to understand.
I have to ask you, and I'm almost afraid to hear the answer back. Has the issue of how evolution, theory of evolution, is taught vice creationism factored into this phenomenon here in Texas?
Oh, here in Texas, it has. That's not an area that I have done my research on, but the creationism, intelligent design debate has definitely been a factor in, especially in the science curriculum. Yeah.
So, Michael, why has public education, I think we all can assume the answer, become the focal point of this phenomenon?
Folks feel like what we'll call the life world is under attack. The life world is your family, your intimate relationships, children. So you find that Christian nationalists, we actually published a study on this, have more children and more grandchildren than anybody else in the United States. So they feel these issues a lot, and they're trying to make sure that they're learning Christian values in the school. So that's one reason. And they're pushing on that because they feel like the very opposite is being taught in some places. And the second, of course, is that the way we structure public schools, that they're more at the local and state level as opposed to a national level. So you can have a lot of influence and have these debates, and you can have Texas having its own set of rules compared to what happens in New York. Right? So these are the 2 main reasons.
And the political implications, particularly given the upcoming date of November 5 and our elections. Where do you see this going?
Okay, so when you have a third of the electorate, it's huge, right? But I'm going to add on 3 more things. Christian nationalists are overwhelmingly churchgoers, and churchgoers are by far the most likely to vote. They're much more likely to vote than other Americans. So they have an outsized influence that way. These issues for Christian nationalist folks are viewed as at a cosmic level, like transcendent. It's like the apocalypse, okay? And in fact, when you ask questions about this, they're far more likely to say that we are in an apocalypse era and that this is life and death. It's not just politics. And then third, the way that nationalists go about constructing the nation, they have to define who's in and who's out, and what it means who's out. They're much more likely to be anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and so on. So these implications all woven together are pretty powerful.
For both of you, you've studied the phenomenon of religion, the history of religion in American national life going back to the foundation of the country before. Have we been through periods like this that are more or less opposite to what we're confronting now, or is this unique?
It is cyclical. You know, each era has its own uniqueness because of the times, because of the media, because of technology. But you can go back in the 1800s and see times when basically the same arguments are happening.
Yeah, that's right. I think that I would point to 2 in particular, and these are from a couple of historians, Stephen Green, and the other ones escaped me for the moment. Yeah, anyway, Stephen Green and another one who I can't remember now. But one is the second generation after the founders. You know, the John Quincy Adams generation was, according to Stephen Green, was one era in which the idea of an explicitly Christian nation began to surface for the first time. And this had to do with a whole lot of political and cultural factors that were going on at the time, and also a religious reawakening that was going on during that time. So I think that's a precedent. Also, the Cold War period, in which there was a perceived need to contrast the United States with the atheist communist world, communist bloc, and it was during that period that we gained our under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, and the In God We Trust became the national motto during that time. So there was an insistence that we are a godly nation, a Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish nation, as opposed to the atheist communists. And I think that, in a sense, the rise of the religious right and the Christian right in particular, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, all the way up to now, has been a basically movement in this direction. So what we're seeing now is a more extreme version of what we've had all along in American politics for the last half century, I guess.
And is the traditional, at least last 30 or 40 years, of identification by those who identify themselves in this movement with the State of Israel still as strong a factor or a diminishing factor?
It certainly seems to be. That's the impression that I'm getting, and it has to do with a lot of different motivations on the part of conservative Christians, including a perceived need to bring the second coming of Christ by favoring Israel, by fulfilling biblical prophecy, and so on. That seems very strong right now. And my recent work on the New Apostolic Reformation, which is kind of an extreme Christian nationalist movement, there is a lot of talk about Israel and strong support for Israel.
A very good friend of mine from the diplomatic world made an observation many years ago about this phenomenon of identification with Israel, which is the Jews are stars of the first act of their drama. They have a minor role in the second act. They're nowhere to be found on the stage in the third. So, final question to both of you, and a big one. What is the role, and I don't use terms like appropriate, that's, I think, incorrect. What is the role of religion, Christianity, or indeed any other definable religious movement in American public life?
So we live in a pluralistic state. You have every right in a democracy to bring yourself, your full self. So you should never have to check your religion at the door. What you should not do is to use your religion to push out other people. Otherwise, you're asking for something that you're denying other people. So the appropriate role of religion is to allow everybody to bring in their religion or their non-religion and bring it to the public table and have the discussion.
I would second all of that Michael has said. I'd also want to add that religious groups are important stakeholders in the democracy, just like businesses or the education or the entertainment industry and so forth. They play a part in our system, and they deserve to have a voice. They need to have a voice in the system. It's also gratifying to see Michael's work on Christian participation in voting in particular. It's good when people are voting. And that's a good thing. We need to applaud that, and we need to have more Americans voting. It's also inevitable, I think, that voters are going to bring their religious and non-religious beliefs to the voting booth. I do as well, as a Christian myself. But again, I think we do live in a pluralistic society. That's something that all of us, religious and non-religious, need to recognize, and that we need to have respect for all religions and those who do not affiliate with any particular religion, which is a growing segment of the population.
I'll actually make an observation and ask you for your thoughts. One last one. Have we ever seen a period in which a genuine movement exists like this? These beliefs are genuinely held, these identities are strongly advocated, but the hyper-instrumentalization of these beliefs, which are not new, they've appeared throughout our republic's history, the manipulation of incitement of playing upon these views by those who transparently have zero views religiously of any kind for partisan political gain. Is that also not new?
That's a good question. I think that there is a new element to it, which is the rise of social media and the ability for politicians, like you're talking about here, to instrumentalize religious belief and have that broadcast widely, have it reach out to many more people than would have been possible for, let's say, a Huey Long or William Jennings Bryan, something like that. I think there's probably more of a danger of the instrumentalization of religion in politics today than there has been before because of these other factors, social factors.
Yeah, and I would just echo that it isn't new, but there are new technologies to make it potentially more dangerous.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel and Gary Abobian. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.